There it goes. All right. Good evening, Internet. Welcome to episode number 270 of the Comic Watcher Show. I'm Matt. He's Chad. And we love comics and we love talking about them. So we are here this evening with a man who should need no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. He founded the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. He's a legend in the underground comic book scene. He founded Kitchen Sink Press, and now he's here hanging out with us. So without further ado, Mr. Denis Kitchen. Thank you, Dennis.
Hello, gents.
How's it going?
Hey, so far so good.
So far so good is the way we like it. Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for hanging out with us this evening and talking shop. I think we're going to talk about the state of the comic book industry. It's going to get deep here, folks. Get real deep. So, but before we dive in, we always like to get to know our guests a little bit. For those who maybe don't know you that well, what is your comic book origin? How did you get involved in comics, and how did you fall in love with the art form?
Oh boy, that goes back to earliest memories. Growing up in the 50s, getting a newspaper delivered every day and devouring the daily strips, taking my 50-cent allowance to a drugstore and buying all 5 comic books for 50 cents, swapping with other kids in the neighborhood. I mean, I think my earliest memories and pleasurable memories are related to comics. And also, as early as I can remember, I started drawing. And, it never ended.
It never ended. A life well spent.
Some could say, yes.
I think so. So, Chad, go ahead. Jump on in.
So, tell us a little bit about, you're getting into the, after you started, as a cartoonist, how you got into the, industry into the larger industry. Yeah.
Well, in high school and in college, I put out self-published zines, I suppose you could call them. And when I graduated from college in 1968, it was at the height of the Vietnam War. And I was caught up in what is now known as the underground comics movement. I self-published my first comic called Mom's Homemade Comics, which was simply set up to the subtitle, Straight from the Kitchen to You. And I could afford to print 4,000 copies, and I managed to sell 3,000 just in my neighborhood, the east side of Milwaukee. Another 500 went to the first comic shop in America, San Francisco comic book store. And the other 500 went to Woodstock with my roommate. So within a very short period of time, I had sold out a 4,000 comic print run. And that made me live like a king for about a month. And then I had to decide whether I was going to stick with it or not. And I chose to stick with it.
Now you've always been a champion of creators' rights and the First Amendment issues, which of course led, in part at least, to the formation of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in the early '90s. And I know you stepped down from the board in 2004, but are you still active with CBLDF at all?
I'm a consultant. I'm on the advisory committee, and I talk to Jeff Drexler, the executive director, pretty often. But no, not day to day.
So, go ahead, Chad.
So, there's a documentary being made about your career. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's called Oddly Compelling. It's in the there's a Kickstarter campaign in the pre-launch stage. So if any of your listeners are interested in supporting it, just go there and hit the notify me on launch button. It should be up, I think, later this month or the beginning of May.
So, what led to Oddly Compelling being made or being in
Well,
pre-production?
that's probably a question best asked of the filmmakers. I think they decided I had an interesting enough career and life, and not just comics, but I think they were taken by some of the maybe unusual things I collect and create outside of comics. That's why it's called Oddly Compelling and not, the comic book life of Dennis Kitchen or whatever might be laser focused on our favorite medium. So I have to say it's strange. I didn't ask for it. I had been a talking head in at least a half a dozen other documentaries about other cartoonists, but I never expected to be the focus of one. I guess if you live long enough, these things happen.
So what was it like being part of the underground comics, I guess, movement, or um, what kind of led you to, be a part?
Well, like I mentioned, I got out of college at a seminal moment in our history. There were marches and protests constantly over the Vietnam War, and my generation was political in general. The women's movement, the gay rights movement, civil rights, legalized pot, stop the war. All these things were burning issues in the culture at that time. And I was a political person. I was caught up in it. And comics were the best weapon I could use to get my points across. So I think anyone who chooses cartooning as a field, there are only a handful of directions you can go. You can go and work for a Marvel or DC or Archie and draw their characters, and they will own it, and you might make a decent living that way. Or my choice was to maintain control of what I did, own the copyright, keep my original art, and be part of something I had some control over and make a lot less money. But in my case, by default, because I had maybe more business sense than the average cartoonist, other underground cartoonists started to come to me and ask if I would help them because I had successfully self-published Moms and was doing more. And when a couple of cartoonists in Chicago, Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson, were putting out Bijou, asked me to publish theirs, I fairly stupidly said, sure, why not? Two's as easy as one, which makes no sense. But at that moment, I became responsible for them and their publication, and I became a publisher. And I'd had a bad experience with a Berkeley publisher named Printmint that I felt had not treated me fairly. So I decided if I'm going to be someone else's publisher, I'm going to apply the golden rule and treat them the way I wish I had been treated when I was seeking a publisher. And so that was, basically my core philosophy. And it very quickly grew. Other cartoonists passing through town, like Robert Crumb and many others, were part of that movement. And then I reached out to cartoonists from the prior generation, like Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman, people that I had admired tremendously, and was bold enough to ask if I could publish their work. And astonishingly, I began doing so. And from there, it just grew and grew. It was kind of a dream come true because I got to work with heroes as well as people in my own generation that I admired.
What are your excuse me? What are your thoughts on independent comics today? It seems like there's more publishers than ever before, but do they have the sort of cultural cash that they maybe once did when you were a younger man?
Well, first of all, I love independent comics and I support them. And there's so many now. You can't say you love everything, but I love the fact that they seem to be growing exponentially. I think one of the advantages they have that I didn't have when I started out in the late 60s was you've got conventions that actually specialize. You've got SPX in Bethesda, you've got Mice in Boston, Mocha in New York, and a number of others, CXC, that basically are built around indie comics and self-publishers. That's amazing. And then you've got the internet, which allows you to market your books in a way far different than I had to do back in the day when I had to physically reach out to brick and mortar head shops before there was such a thing as a comic book shop. And so I embrace it totally. I see indie comics as kind of the grandchildren of underground comics, because Underground's opened the door and showed that you can do it. And I don't think a lot of 20-something indie cartoonists and publishers necessarily make that connection. But I have enough hindsight and experience that I can see that timeline. And I'm glad that things developed the way they did. I think it's only going to get bigger and better. A lot of wonderful things have come out of the independent press. And I have nothing against superhero comics and Marvel and DC and Image and those companies, but I never had any interest in drawing or publishing characters that had superpowers and capes. I was much more interested in stories about real people, whether it was autobiographical or historical or just honest, heartfelt fiction. And I also love the fact that indie comics are drawn in what I would call idiosyncratic styles. It doesn't have to be slick. It doesn't have to be a house style. You can express yourself sometimes in very primitive lines and sometimes in remarkably dense and beautiful lines. And, there's such a diversity out there in every sense of that word that it's hard to sum it up, other than when I go to these shows, and I do attend SPX and Mice and CXC and as many as I can, I always feel inspired just walking down the aisles and seeing how many earnest creators are there and pitching their own work. Even people who might be wallflowers in life, they're bold enough to set up a table and look potential customers in the eye and accept money for what they've created. And it's just a culture that I love through and through.
Throughout your career, who have been your influences? In the comic industry or in the larger, literature industry,
Well,
publishing industry at large, I guess.
Sure. I would have to say the single person above all was Harvey Kurtzman. When he created Mad in the early 50s, that was a truly revolutionary publication for my generation. And I was pretty young, very young, when Mad first came out. But I picked it up further into its run after he was gone. But I followed every other satirical publication he produced, like Humbug and Trump and Help, and eventually Little Annie Fanny and Playboy. I thought Harvey Kurtzman and his hardcore group of cartoonists like Jack Davis and Will Elder and that Wally Wood, that whole EC crew, were just the most amazing group of talent that wherever, probably in one place creating comics. So they were truly inspirational. And among the others, like Will Eisner, the spirit was, in fact, an influence on Harvey Kurtzman. Will was a little older. People like Milton Caniff and Al Capp, Frank King, the amazing people who did the daily strips starting at the turn of the previous century, when there was no definition of what a comic strip was. They created it from nothing. And I look at those beautiful works. I see those full color pages by Winsor McKay and Little Nemo and Flash Gordon. Just the remarkable craftsmanship and the beauty and the storytelling, still inspirational. And this was the kind of thing that most households would have delivered to their doorsteps. And not many people saved those. So when I got to the point where I was a viable publisher, one of the first things I wanted to do was preserve the past. And so I would go to the creators the handful who owned their own work, and most of the time the syndicates, to license the right to collect it. And so that was another one of the pleasures of publishing, was picking and choosing favorites that I could then share with others who I knew were out there. Not that I could ever afford a marketing survey to ask, but I trusted my gut instinct that if I loved a certain classic strip, then so would others. And I was almost always correct.
Was the plan always to go from creator to, the publishing, or did that just something that happened like naturally?
You mean from
Being
new
a creator
comics
yourself?
reprints as well?
Yeah.
I did them simultaneously. So to me, it was all about publishing good comics. And if you were an artist and you sent your submission in the mail and I thought it was good enough, I put it in an anthology. That was just as exciting to me as reprinting, say, Flash Gordon. They were different, and they were probably aimed at different audiences. But nurturing talent and discovering talent, that's exciting. It's you never know when you open the day's mail what might be in the mail. One day I remember in probably the late 80s was a large envelope from Mark Schultz for what eventually became Xenozoic Tales. And it was gorgeous. And he told me later he had sent the same material to 6 different publishers, and I was the only one who answered, which is remarkable to me. But it told me that I was actually paying attention to submissions, and most publishers don't take blind submissions seriously. 90% of it's probably amateurish or inappropriate, and it gets returned or tossed. But I loved finding diamonds in the rough, or surprises. It's part of the reward of being a publisher. And I feel sorry for the other 5 or 6 publishers who ignored Mark Schultz and lost out on a masterpiece.
What are some other books that you stumbled across, I should say, that maybe wouldn't have stood a chance in a more traditional publisher setting?
Well, boy, I can remember getting a submission from Chris Ware while he was still in college. And I remember pointing out to my editor, Dave Schreiner, said, this kid's got real promise. Let's give him a year or so to develop, and I think he'll be ready. And while I waited, I think it was Drawn and Quarterly who decided, no, he's ready now. So sometimes it backfires if you set your standards too high. In retrospect, I should have right away said yes to Chris Ware and watched him develop. Instead, I thought he's not quite good enough. So these are lessons you learn, and sometimes there are existing talents that you reach out to and they're interested in working with you, and other times they're not. And every day to me was a new adventure, just trying to put together the best anthologies and the best books, the highest quality. So while my first preference was to be a full-time cartoonist, I remained a part-time cartoonist and a full-time publisher. It was a different kind of creativity. Sometimes I think of it as maybe being the orchestra leader instead of playing violin in the in the orchestra. It's just a different kind of creativity and participation. And when you have that kind of ability, power to choose, you have to take it seriously and responsibly, and I did my best. There's always a competition, lurking around the corner. If you don't do it well enough, someone will pass you by. So I did it for 30 years. And Kitchen Sink Press, has a legacy I'm still proud of. But I'm glad I'm not publishing today. I think it's more difficult today, as I think one of you said, it's a very crowded field now. When I was publishing at the height of it, there were 10 different distributors, including Diamond and Capital City and other regional and national distributors. Today, you're down to one distributor, and it's in bankruptcy, and nobody knows what's going to happen. It's a tough time. The economy in general, no one knows what's going to happen. So while the comics industry is flourishing, on one hand, you go to a convention, it looks like, wow, there's tens of thousands of people here celebrating this art form, and aisle after aisle of exhibitors. At the core, it's I think a relatively unstable business. And even, comic shops, as I'm sure you guys know, are still at their core selling these stapled pamphlets that we call comic books, when the future is probably graphic novels. And, decisions are being made every day by customers, and the industry is dependent on how these decisions go. Will these pamphlets even last? Are they just a fetishistic format that have been collected for decades and sometimes get valuable? So that's what you must have and put in your white boxes in chronological order? Or is it best to wait, buy that graphic novel, read the whole story at once, put it on a shelf where you can read on the spine what it is? It's an evolving industry, and now I'm more of an observer than a participant.
So let's talk a little bit about the comic book legal defense fund. What kind of inspired you to help, create that
Well,
resource?
I didn't just decide to create it. It kind of came out of, for me, necessity. One of the undergrounds that I published was called Omaha the Cat Dancer by Reed Waller and Kate Worley. You're nodding your head, so you're familiar with it. It was a series I was very proud of. And in 1986, I think, or 88, a shop in suburban Chicago was busted. Two cops walked in and arrested the manager and seized, I think, a dozen or 14 different titles, including Omaha. And they charged the manager with, I think it was displaying obscene material. Not for selling it to a minor or anything else, but just simply displaying material. And it not just was Omaha, but it included Richard Corbin and ElfQuest, of all things, heavy metal. And so the owner of the store called me, and I was not happy to hear that Omaha was part of that, but he assured me he hired an attorney who would take care of it, and he was just keeping me informed. Well, it turned out the attorney he hired had no experience with First Amendment issues, and she did some things poorly, including bad witnesses, or I should say character witnesses. And point is, Mike Correa was convicted, and he was going to have to pay several $1,000s in fine and face up to a few months in jail. And at that point, I was really indignant, and I realized this had to be stopped now, or it would be a terrible precedent. I happened to be in the Twin Cities that weekend attending a small convention, and Sergio Aragones was another guest. And he was the first one I asked. And I said, if I published a portfolio, would you do a plate for it to raise money to try to appeal this case? And he immediately said yes. Then I went to other professionals I knew. It was like Frank Miller, Will Eisner, Robert Crum. I mean, I offhand can't even remember. There were 10 or 12. I published the portfolio, and I got my printer to do it at cost. I convinced the distributors to distribute it without their own markup. And we raised a lot of money. I was able to hire the best First Amendment attorney in the Midwest, a guy who was actually Hugh Hefner's attorney. And so he appealed the case. He won on a technicality, so we got the manager off. And there were still a few $1,000s left in the account. And I remember at that point, the easiest thing to do would be just donate it to another good cause. But I remember thinking to myself, I wonder if there will be other cases like this. Maybe this should be a permanent organization. And that turned out to be the correct choice, because there were lots of other cases, and there had been in the past. The more I dug into it, the problem was if you were a shop in, Poughkeepsie, and cops bullied you into taking things off your shelf, nobody outside of, that shop manager and his close circle of friends ever knew about it. So with the CBLDF and a national organization and an 800 number, suddenly there was an umbrella organization that would protect not just retailers, but anyone whose First Amendment rights in the comics industry were violated. And sometimes that would be a cartoonist or somebody else, but mostly it was shops who are the front line. And in all kinds of communities, you're going to have cops who don't like what you're carrying, or maybe an overzealous local prosecutor who's running for office and thinks busting a comic shop will help them get elected. There's all kinds of reasons. You just have to be prepared. So when it happens, the fund could then basically hire the best local or regional attorney who is experienced in these matters with the highest chance of getting you off the hook. So it wasn't something I just dreamed up one day. It was based on a case where I was personally indignant that someone would force a comic I loved off a shelf, along with others that also did not deserve to be taken off shelves. So, yeah, in hindsight, I'm glad I did it. It was a lot of work when I was already pretty busy, but sometimes you just have to rise to the occasion,
I know you said you're more of an observer of the CBLDF's work today, but just in your estimation, what does the landscape of comics and censorship look like now in 2025?
Well, you should probably have Jeff Truxler on as a guest who can get into the nitty gritty of it more. But again, it's evolving. And, there was a case not long ago where somebody crossing the Canadian border into the U.S., customs inspector saw Japanese anime on his, I forget, iPad or phone that they found objectionable. It was, weird Japanese animated porn, and he was busted. that's not a kind of thing I could have anticipated in the 1980s when I started the fund, and there was no internet. You have now the most prevalent cases are typically local organizations that will try to ban books in libraries. Last year you saw headlines over things like mouse and genderqueer in particular, and others that were trying to be banned by groups who just found them offensive. And so, it's a different kind of outrage, and it's an example of where a comic shop retailer finds themselves, in league with a librarian who's just trying to make things available to their readers. And as much as you try to segregate books that are controversial or restrict readership, there's always going to be, that 12-year-old or, who finds something, takes it home, and the mother freaks out. And the next thing you know, has organized a group to ban that title and many others. So it's an ongoing battle. And sometimes the CBLDF will work in league with the ACLU or other organizations with a common goal, basically of fighting censorship. And I generally am an optimist, but I don't see that that's ever going to end. Our culture is so divisive on so many levels. The last thing they're going to agree on is, what books are suitable or unsuitable for a school library or a public library, which is a whole different battle than what you put on the shelf of your comic shop. There's just always going to be people in this world who are going to try to tell you what you should read or sell or display. And it's not going to end.
So looking back on your career, what is your most memorable work that you yourself, did, and any difficulty? Were there any difficulties in that process of getting it to print or published?
You talking about my own work?
Yes, your own work. Yeah.
No, I mean, I never ran into that problem directly. But back when I was doing underground comics, I think we probably flew under the radar in terms of authorities because, first of all, we were sold primarily in head shops, and head shops were their own kind of outlaw organizations. That most decent neighborhoods didn't want a head shop, selling bongs and pipes and rolling papers in their neighborhood. And so those were kindred spirits to us because for them, a spinner rack of underground comics was a perfect complement. Most of our customers back in the day were what you'd call hippies now. And, smoking weed and reading underground comics kind of went hand in hand. Wasn't required, but we kind of assumed that our customers would often be in an altered state when they read our comics. It was just what helped define that generation. I don't think much has changed today, other than now weed is legal in roughly a third of the country. But undergrounds, as we've discussed, they had their life. They lasted maybe 10 years at most. But there's always going to be cutting edge comics because artists and writers, if they have integrity, are not going to be told what they should create. And the vast majority of them are going to create entertainment that can be read by anyone, but there's always going to be those who push the edge and what I would call troublemakers in a good way, I think. And so when I look back, that was starting the CBLDF is certainly an accomplishment I'm proud of. Publishing some of the classics by cartoonists that I think will stand the test of time. That's something I'm very proud of. My own career as a cartoonist was kind of sacrificed in order to put out the work of others. And, for better or worse, I don't know if I would have even been a successful cartoonist. I never had the chance to try, but I'm kind of making up for lost time now. I'm drawing more, I'm writing, I'm more creative now that I'm in a semi-retired state. And I just know I love the comics medium, and to the degree I'm personally involved, I'm always going to be reading them and observing them and be a part of it. Even my youngest daughter's a cartoonist in Vermont, and it seems to be in the blood. So what can you do?
Oh, having said that, what advice would you have for people, trying to break in today? And part two of the question would be, what do you know now that you wish you knew at the beginning of your career?
Well, the truth is, if you're a practical person, the vast majority of cartoonists are not going to make a lot of money. There are always exceptions. It's the inverted pyramid. At the tip you have those Charles Schultzes and Todd McFarlane's and so the handful who can make a lot of money, and then the bulk of that pyramid is made of people who make a middling income to a low income. So I would say if you're serious about it as a career, you need to be prepared for the fact that it may not be very remunerative. And especially if you have a spouse and children, that's especially important. So I would say, as a practical matter, you may have to have a day job, and cartooning is something you do in your spare time. And depending on how assiduous you are about carving out that time, you may or may not still get a foothold. So it really comes down to, as I think I said earlier, you can go work for the big companies like Marvel or DC or Image or Archie and the rest. But in almost all cases, that's going to be work for hire, meaning the publisher will own the copyright, the trademark, and basically all the rights. At least today, you probably will get your original art back. That's changed. And you might even get something of a royalty from the big companies, though not the same as if you worked for small press. So basically, you can make a decent living working for the big companies. You just won't own what you create. They're going to tell you what to create. They'll give you a script, whether you like it or not. You have to illustrate it. To me, that's not very enticing. Although, again, I'm not knocking it. Those cartoonists made a choice that was right for them. I would say if you're somebody who cares about it as an art form, the good news is you have a field now where anything you create, you can take to one of those indie shows, and for a relatively small amount of money, you can get a table and you can meet the public and find out pretty quickly if people will support it or not. And if you're going down that road, and you're especially lucky if you're like, say a Jeff Smith or Terry Moore, and you have a spouse who's very good at business, that can help you be a lot more successful than if you try to do it by yourself. There's a lot of great husband-wife teams. That's one model to emulate. But it's basically a tough career. In part, it's very crowded. And so you've got a popular art form, and it's so popular that the competition is very tough. When I started, the competition was not that intense, and it was easier for someone like me to survive. When I was an underground comics publisher, there were really four of us. We joked the big four, kind of like the auto industry had the big four. And the other three were in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at that time, I was in Milwaukee as an outlier. And one of the things I learned early on is I survived because the rents were a lot lower in Wisconsin than in San Francisco. And so you have to be practical as well as creative. You asked what advice I would give young creators. Another very basic one is learn to read a contract. If you're going to work for any publisher, whether it's Marvel or Fantagraphics or somebody even smaller, you're probably going to be handed a piece of paper. And if you're unlucky, you'll be handed an agreement a quarter of an inch thick. But it's important to know what you're signing. And too many artists don't understand the legal language. They don't understand that most things are negotiable. I would say never just sign whatever's put in front of you. At least read it, ask questions. If you're at a stage in your career where you think you're pretty popular and you can afford an agent or a lawyer, have them look at it and advise you, because big money can be involved. You might create something where somebody wants to option the film rights, or it's collected into a book by even a larger publisher or translated into other languages. It's important for you to know what your participation in anything else is. Don't just sign that piece of paper that might sign away 90% of what that thing will make when you might have gotten a bigger chunk of the pie. Don't be naive. It's not just about drawing pictures and telling stories. It's about understanding the business you're in and empowering yourself to be able to protect your own rights. And if you can't afford an attorney or an agent, talk to someone else who's been in the business a little longer than you, who's experienced. Ask them. But don't be intimidated by a contract. It's written in English. If you don't understand a word, look it up. And be sure to ask questions. If a publisher wants your work, they're not going to tell you to get lost because you ask questions. They know that smart artists will. Smart artists will say, hey, can I get a larger advance? Hey, can I get a royalty that's another couple of points higher? Hey, keep asking without being obnoxious. It's a business like anything else. And learn a lesson from the sports world or Hollywood, where people get more zeros at the end of their check, but it's still about creativity and protecting yourself.
And about the knowledge that you have gained over the years, what do you know now that you wish you knew at the beginning of your career?
Some of what I just told you, but
Yeah.
It seems like a glamorous life, and in some ways it is, because you're creating your own world with your hand and your mind, and you can, if you're lucky, do whatever you want. But what usually no one tells you is that it can be tough economically, that you have to work with other people, particularly publishers and editors and colleagues you might be collaborating with. And it's important to understand the business model. No one ever explained that to me. I had to figure it out as I went along, and there were no role models for me. I started my company as a blank slate. I just knew I wanted to treat other artists as I wish I had been treated by an unnamed publisher. And so I think if you walk into it a little more sober and not, pie-eyed and thinking, wow, this is so cool, I get to be a cartoonist, what a life. Be prepared. And it's easier if you're young and you're single and unattached, and you don't have to necessarily raise a family and keep a spouse happy with the money you might make, because unless you're working for a big company and you're getting a check every week, those checks are going to be sporadic. Often they're not going to be very large. And, it's kind of like if you're a good looking and talented thespian and you take a bus to Hollywood and you get off and decide you're going to be a star, it doesn't just happen like that. You need lucky breaks. You need to meet the right people, and you need to outcompete other people who are just as beautiful and talented as you are. In other words, it's not easy. And this is why, again, I counsel anyone getting into the field, have a backup day job. If you're lucky, maybe you inherited enough money, or you're a trust baby and you don't have to worry about it. But for the vast majority of us, you have to pay the rent and buy groceries as you're creating comics. So have a backup plan. And then it's still hard work. And if you're good and you're lucky and you're in business with the right people, it might be an extremely rewarding and satisfying life. But it's a challenge.
So, excuse me, switching gears.
Yeah.
What do you like in the last probably 20, 25 years, Japanese influences like in the manga industry have really, really altered the landscape of comics. Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that, on their approach, or just how it has impacted the industry in general?
Well, obviously manga's tremendously successful in America and around the world. It's not my cup of tea, and that's not to knock it. It just, I think by the time it came, my own tastes were such that the manga I saw and read did not particularly move me. But then I was not also growing up with anime on TV and Japanese games and just Japanese culture in general. So I understand that it's captured the imagination of a lot of young American fans. I can't explain it. My first reaction was, what's with the big cute eyes and stuff? I couldn't get past some of the stylistic affectations that just were not my aesthetic. At the same time, I see that it accounts for a way disproportionate share of the American market, and a lot of comic shops could not succeed without having large sections of it. Same with walking into a Barnes and Noble or a bookstore, you're going to see whatever graphic novel section is probably dominated by manga. That's a fact of life. I can't really comment on it further because I'm not a consumer of it. So my observation's pretty superficial. I had a bad encounter about 35 years ago. I was at a big book fair, the American Booksellers Association, and I had 2 tables with kitchen sink products, and across from me was, I think it was Kodansha, one of the large Japanese comics publishers. And on the last day of the show, a Sunday afternoon when things were slow, the gentleman I had been across the aisle from for 3 days walked over to my table, and he picked up one of my titles and he looked at it, and I thought he might be interested in licensing it. So I said, "Is this something that interests you?" And he said, "I could sell 3,000 of these." And I said, "Oh," I mean, to me, that was not insulting. And I said, "Oh, well, let's talk." And then he said, "You don't understand. 3,000 is the waste on my press." And then he turned around and walked away. And I realized I had been insulted by a publisher who measured their sales in millions, not in thousands. And that never left me. That's just a very rude gentleman, and I don't mean to say he represents all of manga, but there was a certain imperious attitude that I deeply resented, and it did not make me love manga anymore after that insulting experience.
I can see that.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that would turn me off. And I'm not even that big of a proponent of manga myself. So,
Are you guys retailers or fans or both?
I'm both. I work part-time at a local comic book store, as well as, Chad and I both run the Comic Watch website. So we get to have we're predominantly a review website. So we get to have that level of a conversation with the industry, and that kind of back and forth every week on New Comic Book Day. And just kind of found over the years, I've kind of found various ways to surround myself with comics in ways that make me happy and continue to boost my love of the genre.
Hey, that's what it's all about. It's
absolutely.
Absolutely. It's words and pictures. People who love to read books and people who like to see movies, to me, it's just an amalgam of both. They're all kind of distant cousins to each other. And, I'm immersed in all of them. I just happen to have made a living in comics.
Sure.
But, I'm sorry. Was it a question there?
I was waiting. I didn't want to unintentionally cut you off.
No.
But yeah, so on the retail side of things, I mean, they're brick and mortar, and of course the internet has changed everything, but there's a certain level of lifeblood to the industry in the brick and mortar comic book stores, because you can go in and you can and talk to your friends or the retailer or someone you've never met before about these things that you love, and it creates community.
Yep.
And are you worried at all that might go away as the internet continues to morph how we consume everything?
It does, and part of that might be a generational prejudice, but yeah, I'm all for comics community. Certainly conventions are a part of that as well, but I think nothing beats going in and talking to a knowledgeable person behind the counter and just talking to other fans who may share your tastes, but may also turn you on to something you've never seen before that you love, or vice versa. It's like anything else. I'm also a baseball fan. If I didn't have a few friends I couldn't talk baseball about, it would be far less fun, because it's the camaraderie, it's the exchanging information, it's impressing your friends with something they didn't know about, or learning something in return. It's part of the pleasure of life. And I think if you were stuck at home and you just looked at your comics digitally and you didn't interact in person with other people, that would be a much duller life. So I'm all for a healthy retail community. And I'm worried now that, Diamond is insolvent, and it's not even clear who's going to buy it and whether they even care about the comics portion of it.
So, with all your contributions to the industry, what do you think you'll be remembered for the most, I guess? Or what do you hope that you're remembered for the most?
Well, that's kind of a tough one. I guess I take pride in what I would call the quality, the selection of material that I did. I didn't just publish something that I thought might make money, but I didn't think was very good. I tried to publish things I was proud of, and that in some ways restricted the growth of my company. And I probably could have gotten faster, quicker, and made more money had I expanded those parameters. I certainly would have made a lot more money if I had sought, heroic comics. I just thought it was pointless to compete with the big companies. And I had personally kind of just outgrown the genre. To me, the hero comics had become formulaic in a way that I just found boring. Whereas what I would loosely call reality comics, I found to be a lot more varied and unpredictable. But again, even those, how many autobiographical comics can you read, especially if they come from someone who's 25 and haven't even really lived a life yet? So there's no genre that's superior to another. It just, I picked my favorites and I did the very best that I could within those parameters. So I hope that's a legacy. But it's not for me to say at the end of the day. I'm already at a point where, fans of a certain age never heard of Kitchen Sink Press or never heard of a lot of things or artists that I published. And that's just the nature of the culture in general. It's like you guys and I might enjoy old black and white movies, but there's some younger fans that are interested in anything that's black and white, whether it's a movie or comic. And we all have prejudices and we all have to make selections. I'm hoping some of the things that I published have a life beyond the immediate life. Every author likes to think they can write a book that will be on the bookshelf indefinitely, but not everyone's a Mark Twain or a Faulkner or Shakespeare. And so the vast majority of anything created is going to be forgotten in a short period of time. It's just the nature of life. So I'm just glad at this stage of my career, I can be on a platform like yours and I can talk to fans, some of whom get it, some of whom don't know half the stuff I'm even referring to because they're maybe rather young or never read anything I published. And so you can never assume anything in this industry or in life. I'm just grateful to be able to talk to you guys right now and know that you love comics and we have that in common.
Chad, do you have any final thoughts?
Oh, I was just going to say, be on the lookout for the Kickstarter campaign about the documentary about Dennis's career, and we'll be following it over on our crowdfunder corner every week when
Thank
it
you,
does
Ted.
launch.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for your time spent with us this evening. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Hey, it was fun for me too.
Well, we're glad to hear it.
Keep it up. Keep promoting comics and do your part.
Absolutely.
You're
Everybody.
part of that community we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Digital and otherwise. So,
Right.
Chad, who are we talking to next week?
I forget, but I think that whoever it is that they're involved with the Comixology reader program.
Excellent. I can't wait to have that conversation. Well,
All
Denis Kitchen, thank you very much for hanging out with us tonight. Thank you for listening tonight. And as ever, get out there, support local art, support local comic shops, and most of all, just do something good in the world. Thank you so much for listening. We are the Comic Watchers, and this is our show. We'll see you next time.